Yishar Kochachem to our very, very talented Beth El Choir and Chazan Pomerantz-Borough and Cantor Share for leading and inspiring them as they in turn inspire us. It is a great joy to welcome all of you here on Yom Ha'atzmaut as HaER is about to commence, and to gather once again for the Yom Ha'atzmaut celebration here at Beth El. It's great to be able to bring together so many Ohavei Tzion, lovers of Zion, Zionism, Israel, and the one and only Jewish state. We have a moral obligation as Jews worldwide to stand together, Jews united across political spectrum, to make sure that Israel remains the bastion of freedom in the Middle East, the strong and unshakable partner of the United States of America, and the finest shining example of the Jewish dream for world peace, centered around the one and only homeland of the Jewish people. We can look at world history, of course, and learn a lot. But as it has been said, history teaches only that history teaches. Which lesson you choose to draw upon is a reflection of what you decide is relevant, poignant, and speaks to your heart and mind in any given time. In thinking about the negotiations over Iran's nuclear bomb, you can choose the Northern Ireland example and conclude that negotiations and not violence are the answer. You can look at Iraq and conclude that making war in the Middle East is a misguided and ultimately disastrous choice. But you can also look at World War II and think that appeasement, or not believing tyrants when they threaten your very existence, is a deep lesson to be learned here as well. You read the page you want and draw the conclusions you may have begun with anyway. But at the same time, we, lovers of Israel and supporters of the Jewish state, can never stand idly by and close our eyes to cold, hard facts and steely threats that come against the Jewish state. We owe it to Israel to not only stand strong when it comes to supporting Israel through our donations, but also, and perhaps more importantly, by raising our voice here in the United States, where it can do the most good to re-strengthen the bonds between the bastion of democracy in the West and the bastion of democracy in the East. To be able to do so, however, we must be armed, not with weapons, but with facts. Facts that are a reflection of our commitment to strengthening Israel in every way possible. It is our great pleasure to invite to our bima here at Congregation Beth El, a man I truly believe to be an Ohavei Tzion, a lover of the Jewish state and a defender of Jewish people. Bret Stephens is the foreign affairs columnist and deputy editorial page editor at the Wall Street Journal, with responsibilities for the paper's editorial pages in Europe and in Asia. He is a member of the paper's editorial board and a regular panelist on the Journal Editorial Report, a weekly political show on the Fox News Channel. Mr. Stephens joined the Wall Street Journal in '98, first as an op-ed editor in New York and later writing in Brussels. In 2002, many of you will know that he was named the youngest editor-in-chief ever at the Jerusalem Post, a position he assumed at the tender age of 28. 3 years ago. At that post, he oversaw the paper's news editorial, electronic and international editions, and also wrote a weekly column. He returned to the Wall Street Journal in 2004, and following year was named Young Global Leader in World Economic Forum, won numerous journalistic awards, including, as our President Eric mentioned, the Pulitzer-Prize for commentary in 2013. And most recently, he wrote this wonderful book, America in Retreat, which you should all purchase, and you can have autographed by Bret Stephens. Bret Stephens was educated at the University of Chicago and London School of Economics. He is married to his wife, Corinna, a classical music and opera critic for the New York Times. I think it was an interesting dinner conversation. And Bret and Corinna live with their 3 children in Manhattan. It is my pleasure to welcome to Beth El and introduce to all of you Mr. Bret Stephens.
Thank you for the very lovely introduction, Rabbi. The preemptive standing ovation. I'll see if I get one when I walk off the stage. I probably should clarify 2 points of the biography that you just mentioned. One of them, because this invariably comes up whenever I speak, there's a question about my last name, Stephens, which obviously is a hallowed Jewish name with a PH. Norman Podhoretz likes to tell the story about the Wall Street Journal, how it is that it has this remarkably pro-Israel editorial page. And as Norman puts it, he says, there are these 2 guys, young guys at the Journal who write those pro-Israel editorials. One guy is named Stephens, and the other guy is named Pollock. And the funny thing is that Pollock isn't Jewish. Stephens is. I should, one more point, because this was now, since I won the Pulitzer-Prize, everyone makes a big to do about it. When I called when I learned that I was notified that I won the prize, I called my mom, and I said, Mom, I won the Pulitzer-Prize. And she said, oh, that's nice, sweetie. Now the stupid people will know you're smart. So with those 2 clarifications, well, listen, thank you very much for coming out this evening to hear me. I think I have a sense that many of you have come out not simply to listen to me, but because of...
I'm just going to put the microphone.
These are better?
Or just come to one side.
All right.
Hear you a little better.
Is that better?
You tell me, is it better?
Better?
Yeah.
Better?
Okay.
Good. Okay.
Okay, thank you.
Wave if you. But I think you've come out because there's a sense very palpable in the Jewish community, and I think very palpable throughout the United States, that our foreign policy is in a very bad way. That we are living in a world of increasing and metastasizing disorder. This disorder threatens us here in the United States, at least in the middle or long term, but threatens Israel in the immediate term. And we're concerned about it. We're wondering how to deal with it, how to think about it. So I'd like to begin talking, and I'll get to the subjects that you all want to hear about, but I want to begin this evening talking a little bit about an event that happened just a few months ago that I think is too easily forgotten. And that is the attacks in Paris on the editorial offices of Charlie Hebdo, the satirical newspaper, and then, of course, of that random supermarket somewhere. People just happen to be there. No, the Hyper Kasher, the kosher supermarket, the following day. Because I think these events, when we think about them deeply and we think about them carefully, tell us something about where we are. And they tell us about where we might be going. They also tell us something about where we've been, and they resolve, I think, some important debates. Let me begin with that. Ever since about 9/11, if not before, there's been a very interesting question that has been debated certainly in foreign policy circles, but I think in the country at large. And the question, roughly speaking, is this: why do they hate us? Why is it that so much of the Arab and Muslim world is so aggrieved and so aggressive? Why is it so frequently prone to turning towards terrorism? Why is it so saturated with hatred of the West and hatred of the Jews? What has happened to this civilization? And what can we do about it? And the debate has basically broken down along two sides. One group of people, and this group includes Ron Paul, this group includes a lot of people on the left, the Dennis Kuciniches of the world. One group of people will say they hate us because of our policies. They hate us because we've been supporting Israel these past 67 years. They hate us because we have undertaken these wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, and before that, during the Gulf War. They hate us because we're exploiting their natural resources. They hate us because of the legacy of colonialism, because of the coup in Iran in 1953. You sometimes hear the president explain this history of enmity with reference to a 1953 coup, never bothering to explain that among the people who were most delighted to see Mossadegh go were, of course, the Islamists, including the Ayatollah Khomeini in 1953. But this is a side point. So the argument is, they hate us because of our policies. How do you solve that hatred? Well, you change the policy. You stop becoming involved in the politics of the Middle East. You withdraw troops. Above all, you stop supporting Israel. If you do that, or at least you mute your support for Israel, you follow a more even-handed approach, as they say, between the Israelis and the Palestinians. According to this line of argument, if you do that, then you're going to get a much better relationship with the Muslim world. And indeed, when President Obama paid a visit to Cairo in June of 2009, that is precisely the message that he was carrying. Too many decades of mistrust and misunderstanding, and this was going to be solved by a new relationship that began with getting the United States out of Iraq, getting the United States out of the Middle East, by putting daylight between the White House and the government in Jerusalem. That was the promise of the Cairo speech. That's why some of us found that speech disquieting. Now, on the other side of the argument for this debate was that it was wrong to suggest that the policy was the root of the problem. Oh, for sure, the Arab and the Muslim world hated Western policies, but that didn't explain the hatred. That was not at the root of their civilizational fury. The root had to do with values. It had to do with the concept of civilization. It had to do with the way we treat our women, our minorities, our gay people in the West, and how they treat theirs. It had to do with our notions of free speech and what could be said in public, what could not be said in public. It had to do with the way we chose to dress. It had to do with all those constituent elements that make the West, central to which is our idea of a society and a civilization built on the concepts of freedom, tolerance, the separation of religion and state. That was the issue. That was what they were against. And this was the argument that took place for a good 13 or 14 years. And then in January of 2015, two jihadis walked into the editorial offices of a paper that specialized in scatological and sometimes semi-pornographic humor, that took aim equally at religious Jews, religious Christians, and religious Muslims. And these two jihadis walked in there and murdered 12 people in their seats. I think it is very difficult to reflect on the attacks in Paris and not conclude that at the root of those attacks was a hatred not of our policies, not because Charlie Hebdo was closely associated with the neoconservatives and Paul Wolfowitz and John Bolton. They hated us because of the freedom that Charlie Hebdo insisted on exercising. And after that attack, I think it's impossible to make the argument with a straight face that the problem in the Middle East that we face is a problem rooted in our policies, a problem that we can solve by changing those policies, by making ourselves less offensive to them. That isn't going to work. That will simply embolden them. That will simply let them know that we have successfully been cowed. So I was pleased when the Wall Street Journal, after the attacks on Charlie Hebdo, reprinted the cover with Mohammed of their last publication. It has to be done. We have to instruct the Muslim world in a pedagogy of offense. They have to understand that the price of living in the modern world is that you have a right to give offense and you have a responsibility to know how to receive it in a civilized way. Now the second lesson of those attacks came with a second attack. The attack on Jews simply doing their shopping for their Shabbat dinner. Now, you often hear it said, and you have people like Karen Armstrong who want to know better, said that the reason Jews are being targeted throughout Europe is because Muslims in Europe object to Israeli policy vis-a-vis the Palestinians, vis-a-vis the Arab world. As Leon Wieseltier put it, if you try to explain anti-Semitic acts by referring to what some other group of Jews is doing in some other place, you're not explaining the anti-Semitism, you're replicating the anti-Semitism. That was a reminder that the war that is being waged on Israel is not being waged on Israel because of the settlements. It's not being waged on Israel because of overflights of Israeli warplanes over Lebanon. It's being waged on Israel because Israel is the Jewish state. It is a war against the Jews. And we should think about the kind of anti-Semitism that is now spreading throughout Europe. You know, after the attacks on the supermarket, on the kosher, on the hyper kasher, all these signs suddenly sprang up miraculously throughout France. Je suis juif. How lovely. How nice. This was the same country that only a month before those attacks, only a month earlier, in December of 2014, the French Parliament voted by an overwhelming majority symbolically to recognize a Palestinian state. This in turn happened just a few months after a portion of that Palestinian state, known as Hamastan, decided to unleash a barrage of thousands of rockets aimed indiscriminately at Israeli civilians. This is the response of the French government to an act
of unprovoked and murderous aggression against Israeli civilians, and we're supposed to let the parliament off the hook? There are two kinds of anti-Semitism that are stalking Europe and frankly are stalking parts of the United States as well. One is the very low anti-Semitism that you find in the banlieue, that you find in the inner cities, that you explain by way of being an outgrowth of Middle Eastern values, Middle Eastern politics, Middle Eastern furies. But the other is the very high anti-Semitism that goes by the name of anti-Zionism, or simply strong criticism of Israel. Strong criticism of Israel that never seems to be levied at any other state for doing exactly the same sorts of things. By the way, I'm waiting for the French Parliament to speak up on the Saudi bombing campaign in Yemen for the indiscriminate slaughter of civilians there. I'm just waiting for the UN resolutions to come pouring forth. I was in Europe. I was living in Europe, working for the Wall Street Journal in Brussels in the summer, late summer of 2000, when the Second Intifada broke out. And I'll never forget, this was sort of a moment for me as a young Jew, semi-young Jew, when after the Second Intifada began, after Palestinians had dipped their hands in the blood of those two Israeli reservists who had happened to just drive into Ramallah, The Economist magazine, which is supposed to be the most prestigious magazine in Europe, had an editorial that said, Israel is a superior people, its talents are above the ordinary, but it must curb its greed for other people's land. And I remember thinking, if you just inserted or replaced the word Jew for Israelis, you'd have the most venerable, classic anti-Semitic slur in the book. Jews, clever, but greedy. And this was coming from the pages of The Economist magazine. And we need to be more alert to this kind of anti-Semitism, if possible, than the kind of anti-Semitism that's coming from the gutters. The anti-Semitism that's coming from the gutters, we know, we understand, is easy to condemn. But the one that is eating us as a community is the anti-Semitism that's coming on high, that is claiming to speak out against the Jewish state in the name of progressive causes or liberal causes. That's the most dangerous kind of anti-Semitism, the most insidious kind of anti-Semitism. And just here, let me say, before I move on to my next point, many of you no doubt have kids or either children or grandchildren who are of high school or college age, and they're coming back from campuses alarmed at what they're seeing, feeling like they have to keep quiet, feeling like the political mood on campus forces young Jews to choose between their liberalism and their affinity and their love for Israel. And you should tell your kids, you should have your kids say, you've got to stand up and you've got to say to those people in the BDS campaigns and the Palestinian Solidarity campaigns, the country I support, Israel, is the only country that supports women's rights in the Middle East, the only country that supports gay rights in the Middle East, the only country that bans the death penalty in the Middle East, the only country that supports the interests of environmentalism in the Middle East, the only country that puts former prime ministers and presidents in jail if they commit crimes in the Middle East. The Palestinians don't do it. The Iranians certainly don't do it. So if you consider yourself a liberal or a progressive, the only country you can defend, the only country that shares your values is the country you're busy condemning. Have them say this. Now, the third thing that we need to learn from the attacks in Paris comes from the fact that, as we quickly learned, at least one of the brothers, the Kouachi brothers, who conducted the attacks on Charlie Hebdo, was trained in Yemen by Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, AQAP. And it's for me. It's Mrs. Giuliani. The third thing we should bear in mind is this was an attack that didn't simply come from the streets of Muslim France. It came from the Middle East. This is a Middle East we've been trying to tell ourselves for the past 5 or 6 years is an area of the world we can draw a fence around and ignore. But just as Trotsky, my favorite philosopher, actually, true story, this is completely to the side. I grew up in Mexico. My grandmother knew Trotsky in Mexico before he was assassinated. And I said, Grandma, what was Trotsky like? She said, amazing. I was curious to know myself when I went to meet the great leader of the proletariat. I said, so what was he like? She said, I'll never forget the exquisite cut of his French bespoke suit, and his wonderful deerskin leather gloves. But Trotsky famously said, you may not be interested in war, but war is interested in you. Well, guess what? Americans may not want to be interested in the Middle East, but the Middle East is interested in us. The fantasy that we can simply bring our troops home, ignore the problems, follow the Sarah Palin doctrine of foreign policy known as let Allah sort it out, and wish it all away, that is a dangerous illusion. We may not be interested in the Middle East, but the Middle East is interested in us. You know, during the first 4 years of the Obama administration, he kept telling us the tide of war is receding. Core al-Qaeda is on a path to defeat. Groups like al-Qaeda in Iraq are the JV team of terrorism. The future of terrorism lies in small-scale attacks that might be outrages but aren't an existential threat to the United States. By the way, we have the Iranians in a box. They're contained. Excuse me. These were the sorts of things that we're being told for the first 6 years of this administration, that we had solved the problems of the Middle East. And how had we solved them? Simply by getting out. And yet what we've seen in the last 2 years is a cascade of disaster. It is hard to keep pace with the speed of the catastrophes as they are unfolding piece by piece, one at a time. Syria, Iraq, Yemen. I mean, it is astonishing how quickly things are moving. And we need to think seriously about what this means and what we can do about it. Because we have declared that in the Middle East, what used to be known as Pax Americana, peace imposed by the strength of American arms, or at least by the strength of American credibility, that's going to go away. And we have imagined that when we take it away, it's going to be filled by, peaceful NGOs doing God's work here and there. Not so. When you create power vacuums around the world, and this is true not only in the Middle East, but it's true in Ukraine, it's true in the South China Sea, those power vacuums are filled. And they are invariably filled by the most willful and the most violent actors. That is the essential fact, that is the essential thing that is happening today in the Middle East. Excuse me. Is there... God, I feel like Marco Rubio. It's even Poland Spring. Buenas tardes. I'll deliver the rest of my speech in Cuban accented Spanish. A couple things we should be mindful of. Look at what's happened in Syria. We lulled ourselves into imagining, first of all, that Syria was going to follow the course of the Egyptian revolution and was going to end swiftly and relatively well. So we did nothing. Then as things became more violent, we lulled ourselves into imagining that Assad's days were numbered. This was another promise made repeatedly by the Obama administration. And so we had to do nothing, and the crisis became worse. Then we lulled ourselves into thinking that, well, as bad as the crisis may be in Syria, it's not going to overspread the boundaries of Syria. And then we got 1 million refugees in Lebanon, and 2 million refugees in Turkey, and close to 1 million refugees in Jordan. putting huge pressure on all of those countries. And still we did nothing. Then we had reports about Assad using chemical weapons, which for over a year we chose to downplay and ignore, until President Obama said that that was going to be a red line for him. And then that red line was flagrantly crossed. And effectively, we did nothing. You hear the Obama administration saying, oh, we got rid of Syria's chemical weapons. Except the Syrians are still dropping chlorine bombs on their own people. And we know very well that what we got rid of was a declared stockpile, but not the full stockpile. So we pretended that we'd solved that problem. We hadn't. And suddenly what we found is that the opposition, the moderate opposition we thought we could support, began to vanish. And it was replaced by more extreme elements. First, it was replaced by Al-Qaeda. But then Al-Qaeda turned out to be too moderate for another group called Islamic State. And we did nothing about them. And suddenly Islamic State took over not just large tracts of eastern Syria, but most of northern Iraq. And only then did we say, oh, we need to do something. People say we got out of the Middle East. We have 3,500 American soldiers in Iraq today. How often do you hear about our troops in Iraq from anyone in the administration? We're pretending they're not there. Maybe when they take Ramadi, maybe when they take portions of Baghdad, will we understand that the consequences of inaction are often far more grave than the consequences of action. This is a lesson. And then this brings us to the other subject, which is the Iranian nuclear deal. I want to, for the sake of honest argumentation, I want to give you the smartest argument that the administration can make for the deal it's trying to seal with the Iranians. If you really listen carefully to what the administration is saying, they're going to say this. They're going to say, okay, let you in on a secret. We're not going to be able to stop Iran from getting a bomb. Sanctions aren't going to work. Sanctions regime was falling apart anyway, and frankly, between you and me and the vast majority of Americans, we don't want to undertake military action against the Iranians. It's too dangerous, it's too costly, it wouldn't have political support, and frankly, the Iranians would just reconstitute their program in a matter of a few years. So that's a fool's gambit. What we're going to do is reach a deal not that isn't about preventing Iran from getting a bomb, it's about managing and slowing its acquisition of a bomb. And if we're able to do this in a structured way over, say, 10 years, then the Ayatollah Khamenei is going to die, and a new Iranian leadership is going to emerge, and this Iranian leadership is going to be more moderate, it's going to be more in tune with the wishes of the Iranian people, especially its youth who rose up during the Green Revolution in 2009. And so without violence, we will be able to bring Iran into the modern world. And who knows what could happen in 10 years? I mean, we might find that the Iranians become very friendly with us. And after all, we have a lot of shared interests with Iran when it comes to ISIS, when it comes to drug interdiction, all kinds of things. So that's the argument that the administration, sotto voce, is offering. And that's an interesting argument. I wish the president, I wish the administration were honest enough to actually say what I just said, right? Then we could have a really honest discussion. And then it would need a very honest reply, okay? First of all, leaving aside what you choose to do with Iran, the United States is in no position to tell the Saudis or the Turks or the Egyptians or the United Arab Emirates why they, too, should not get precisely the same kinds of nuclear capabilities that the Iranians do. So how are we going to prevent, with the terms that have just been described, the beginning of a nuclear arms race in the heart of the Arab and Muslim world? We will not be able to prevent it. Who are we to tell the Saudis, you can't have enrichment, you can't have a plutonium reactor? We can't do that. So we are beginning this, we are inviting a nuclear arms race between 4 or 5 nascent, immature nuclear powers, all of them at daggers drawn with one another. Some of you may be old enough to remember the Cold War. I'm not. But then it was a symmetrical standoff between the USA and the USSR with roughly equal numbers of nuclear weapons. And even then, it took geniuses like Albert Wohlstetter and Herman Kahn to figure out how you conduct deterrence between 2 powers, 2 equal powers. How do you conduct deterrence when it's Israel and Saudi Arabia versus Iran, or maybe it's Saudi Arabia and Turkey versus Israel? Is it Saudi Arabia and Pakistan against India? Is it India and Israel against Pakistan? How do you game that out? I'd like to meet the genius in the office of the vice presidency who has this all figured out. So that's the first point that we should ask about this. The second point we should ask is, why exactly are we so confident that the Iranian regime is moderating? The White House keeps telling us, oh, we have to separate what Iran is doing with the nuclear issue with what Iran is doing in the rest of the region, the support for terrorism, effective seizure of capitals in Baghdad, Damascus, Beirut, Sana'a, and Gaza City for that matter. Oh, that's completely separate. It's very male to be able to compartmentalize one form of bad behavior and another form of bad behavior. We keep saying this, but if you're an Iranian, you're not compartmentalizing. You're saying to yourself, we're winning on every front. So why exactly would having a nuclear weapon, or at least a nuclear capability, be a bad thing? Instead of moderating its behavior, it's going to turbocharge its behavior. Just think about it. This was a regime that, without the benefit of a nuclear weapon to defend itself, was prepared to set off a bomb in a fancy restaurant in Washington, D.C. for the sake of assassinating the Saudi ambassador. What would that regime be capable of doing if it thought it was invulnerable because it had a nuclear arsenal? Ask that question. I wish someone in the administration would ask that question. But the most important question that should be asked is, what is the character of this regime? And this comes down to an important point. People often think about, Iran as a kind of a problem of proliferation or deterrence, et cetera, very kind of classic Kissingerian terms. But if you're a liberal, ask yourself, do you want a regime that is capable of taking a stone in one hand and stoning a woman to death? Do you want that same regime to take a nuclear bomb in its other hand and do likewise with its neighbors? We aren't worried about Francois Hollande having his finger on the nuclear button. I mean, Francois Hollande has his fingers on other buttons. Those are his issues. But we do worry about the Ayatollah Khamenei having it, because this is a regime that was capable of sending tens of thousands of young children into minefields to clear those minefields. We should not be confident that under no circumstances would it ever use a bomb. On the contrary, there are many circumstances in which it might use a bomb, and we should be mindful of that. So the easy argument that if you do nothing, if you take the course of inaction, you will be safe from harm. It's been disproved everywhere else we've looked in the Middle East, and it will be disproved with Iran. We just had on the front pages of the Wall Street Journal a story that by next year, North Korea is going to have 40 nuclear weapons. Bill Clinton signed a deal that was supposed to solve the North Korean nuclear crisis 20 years ago. Why are we so sure that the Iranian deal is going to turn out better? I would not be so sure. People need to think about this very clearly. And they need to think, too, that while any military strike on Iran's nuclear facilities would have unforeseen consequences, I doubt those unforeseen consequences are going to be worse than the perfectly foreseeable consequences of one of the world's most dangerous regimes getting its hand on the most dangerous weapons we can think of. Now, where does this leave Israel? Because this is the subject of the speech, Israel in the Middle East in the post-Pax Americana world. I wrote a column on Tuesday. I titled it Israel Alone. I will be selling subscriptions to the Wall Street Journal for those of you who didn't read it later on. Israel finds itself in as precarious a position as it has for many, many years. Americans still want out of the Middle East. As the problems of the Middle East become worse, we see no good solutions. It becomes like salted peanuts. We're going to the bottom. We want out of the Middle East. It's very hard to persuade Americans until we will be attacked again as we were on 9/11. It will be very hard to persuade Americans to involve ourselves in a major way in Middle Eastern politics, Middle Eastern affairs. And so Israel is going to find itself in an increasingly isolated position. And it needs to think about how it should conduct itself. The kind of isolation it last experienced in the first 19 years of its history, between 1948 and its birth and 1967 and the Six-Day War. Well, first of all, I think it is necessary that Israel and supporters of Israel begin to mount a serious rhetorical defense of the state of Israel that does not begin with an apology, that does not begin by counting all the ways in which it has sinned against its neighbors and all the ways it might show that it is prepared to take risks for peace. Israel has been taking risks for peace nonstop for over 35 years. The result of it is Israel today finds itself more hated and more detested than it ever has been before. Let's bear that history in mind when we consider whether Israel would be wise to go for the next round of territorial withdrawals for the sake of appeasing some portion of Palestinians who will not be appeased, they will merely be emboldened. And let's also say that if the Palestinians want a state, please can they demonstrate that they deserve a state? I'll tell you, the Kurds deserve a state. They demonstrated that they deserved a state. The Tibetans deserve a state. They're led by someone, the Dalai Lama, who's estimable. All kinds of people around the world deserve a state. Maybe the Wallonians, if you've ever heard of the Wallonians. I lived in Belgium. How could I not have heard of the Wallonians? Deserve a state. And yet somehow it's the Palestinians who are supposedly uniquely entitled to a state. Well, excuse me, I don't think so. I think they need to demonstrate don't subject the Palestinians to the soft bigotry of low expectations. Don't say it's okay that your supposedly moderate and democratic president is now in the 11th year of his 4-year presidential term. Don't say that it's okay that half of your entity is controlled by a group called Hamas, which has sworn to the destruction of Israel and the murder of Jews wherever they might be found. Don't say that it's okay that this little country that had an opportunity when Israel withdrew in full from the Gaza Strip, turned the Gaza Strip not into another little Hong Kong or Singapore on the Mediterranean, but turned it into a little Al-Qaeda-stan or another terrorist enclave dedicated to doing nothing but lobbing missiles at Israel, even if it means the immiseration of their own people. Let's not get bamboozled with the idea that Israel somehow uniquely blockades the Gaza Strip, when, as anyone who can look at a map knows perfectly well, that Gaza also shares a border with Egypt, which for excellent reasons has blockaded Gaza, because it understands what a threat that little enclave poses. I'm entirely in favor of a Palestinian state that looks like Canada, minus Quebec. I'm not in favor of a Palestinian state that looks like Yemen. Simple as that. Prove to me, Palestinians, that you can be Canada and not Yemen, or even Costa Rica. I'll take Costa Rica. But until that time, until you have shown that you are morally entitled to a state that you are actually prepared to contribute to what used to be called the March of Civilization, I'm not going to hear it. And I'm certainly not going to put the Jewish people at risk for the sake of mollifying guilty consciences around the world, including, I have to say, too many guilty Jewish consciences. The last thing I want to say tonight is be prepared to act. Be prepared to act. You know, one of the things that David Ben-Gurion taught the Israeli people that they should bear in mind today was that wonderful line, Shmum, international legitimacy. What is that? What is international legitimacy when it is bestowed by an organization like the United Nations? What is it? Who are the Europeans to talk to us about international legitimacy? Who exactly are they to talk to us about it? Why are the Jewish people constantly being given lectures about what kind of force they may be prepared or allowed to exert in defense of Jewish lives? Since when did the term proportionality mean that Israel could not defend itself vigorously against indiscriminate terrorist attacks? How have these terms been turned on a people and a nation that has been begging for peace for 67 years of its history? The Israelis have to come and have to make a decision. We're not interested in seeking someone else's moral approval for our continued existence. And we are prepared to act and act with initiative if necessary to defend ourselves. Look, this is the 67th year of Israel's existence, not a very long existence. In 1967, Israel found itself in a position not very dissimilar to the one it finds itself in today. Think about it. On the 4th of June of 1967, 4th of June 1967 was the day before the beginning of the Six-Day War. Now, everyone in this room knows what happens on the first day of the Six-Day War. Israel conducted the single most successful military strike in 20th century history. But the day before the Six-Day War, what did the Israelis know? They knew that Nasser had put in hundreds of thousands of troops into the Sinai and was pledging Israel's destruction. They knew that the United States had declared that it would be neutral in word, and deed. Word, thought, and deed, according to Dean Rusk's State Department, when it came to conflict between Israel and its neighbors. They knew that Charles de Gaulle had unilaterally declared an arms embargo on Israel. They knew from their ambassador in Moscow that Andrei Gromyko, the Soviet foreign minister, had said to the Israeli ambassador, if you preempt, if you attack, we will come fully to the support of our Arab client states. They knew that an effort by the international community to break the illegal blockade of the Straits of Tiran, south of Eilat, had gone absolutely nowhere. They knew that Egypt, Iraq, Syria, and Jordan had signed so-called mutual defense treaties, which of course was an agreement to obliterate Israel. And on the 4th of June of 1967, the Israeli cabinet met to figure out what it was going to do. And one cabinet minister said, what we should do, clever guy, is we should send a ship, a cargo ship, through the Straits of Tiran to break the blockade, or try to break the blockade. The Egyptians will fire on it. They'll kill 10 of our sailors or so. It'll be a kamikaze mission or a suicide mission. But then we'll have legitimacy. Then we'll have justification. And then another member of the cabinet said, under no circumstances should we go to war without the benefit of a major power as an ally. And the United States, under Lyndon Johnson, was not prepared to be an ally. And David Ben-Gurion, who was no longer prime minister, even sent in a telegram or made a call, and he said, what's the rush to go to war? And at that meeting, Yigal Allon, who was then the labor minister and would later become foreign minister, he said something that I think is the most important statement in Jewish history, or at least recent Jewish history. He said, "They will condemn us if we attack, but we will survive." And so Israel attacked, Israel was condemned, but Israel survived. If you take nothing away from tonight's lecture, nothing else away, please remember that the reason Israel came into existence was not to showcase the victimization of the Jewish people. It was to end that victimization. Thank you.
We have a couple of lights set up so everybody can hear the questions. Because we're not going to go on that aisle set.
Okay, I can talk pretty loud. Here's the nightmare scenario that I worry about. Israel does well when it strikes first. It's a small country, not fighting a long war, did great in the Six-Day War, but in the Yom Kippur War, when they waited, they were in serious trouble. Yes, they recovered. If Iran gets nuclear weapons and just uses them to blackmail the West and then fires on Israel, and then if Israel's hit with 2 or 3 of them, the United States, which didn't respond to help any of the Christian countries during World War II until we were in the war, who has not done anything to help the Ukrainians, who gave up the 3rd largest nuclear arsenal, and President Clinton and the Russian, and I forget who signed it, the British, guaranteed their integrity. Now you can argue as politicians will argue, well, what are we talking about? The purpose, the body. Okay, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to. So how does Israel handle that nightmare thing where they have a deterrent, a blackmail against the West, and they're struck first, but they have no second deterrent?
Look, the lesson of the 20th century is that the worst can happen. To your question, could a nuclear Iran successfully blackmail the West while it conducts a war against Israel? Absolutely. This is precisely why waiting on events is a disastrous thing for the Israelis to do. Wishful thinking has never served the Jewish people well. Closing your eyes to what is happening before your face does not serve the Jewish people well. Depending on the benevolence of others has not served us well, and which is why I think it has been a mistake that Israelis have put too much hope in the political processes going on here in the United States. I'm glad Bibi came to speak to Congress. I thought he gave a terrific speech. I thought the president misplayed his hand, both politically and strategically, very, very badly. But that being said, that's not what Bibi should be doing. Not in the sense of trying to persuade Americans this is your problem too, but what he should be focused on is, above all, whether it's an American problem or not an American problem, it's our problem. And we have a Jewish state so that we can deal with these kinds of problems. And we've been hearing from the Israelis, we're prepared to act, we're prepared to act. At some point, those threats, if they aren't carried out, will appear to be hollow, and they will be challenged. And I hope that the Israelis aren't bluffing when they say that they're prepared to destroy Iran's nuclear facilities. I mean, we're not 2 minutes to midnight, we're half an hour past midnight right now. And still the Israelis have done nothing. And so the Israelis have to think very carefully about the idea that at some point in time, the United States is going to act. Quite possibly, we're not going to do anything.
Quite possibly we won't. Foolishly, but we won't. Let's not allow Israel to become the Czechoslovakia of the 21st century.
Thank you for your powerful words. I only wish there was hundreds more prominent Jews like yourself. My question is, you spoke about anti-Semitism. On some level, do you think our president is anti-Semitic?
No, I don't. I resist. I resist what is, I think, a very now widespread temptation to personally impugn the president. I don't think he's anti-Semitic. I don't think he's anti-Semitic. B, I don't think it gets us anywhere to call him an anti-Semite. I just think that the policies he is pursuing are totally disastrous. Both for the United States and of course for Israel. I mean, it is not for us to know what is in the hearts of other men and women. He's surrounded him. His Treasury Secretary is an Orthodox Jew. His chief of staff in his first term of office is the son of an Israeli, now the mayor of Chicago, for his sins. And that I think, I don't think that helps us. I think it helps us to point out that the policy that the president is pursuing, even if it's the best intended policy in the world and the road to hell is paved with those proverbial intentions, is going to be a disaster for the state of Israel, which he purports at least to greatly support, but it's also going to be a disaster for the United States. As I said in the speech, you may not be interested in the Middle East, Mr. President. You may want to do some nation building at home. You may want to pivot to Asia. You may want to build Obamacare. You may want to sing Kumbaya with Ayatollah Khamenei. But the love ain't reciprocated. And someone ought to be aware of that. And if he isn't, the rest of us, especially people who vote Democratic and have some influence with his party, ought to be speaking out vociferously.
Thank you for your wise words this evening. You've given us some advice as to what we can do. I hear a lot of pundits and analysts and people who've been in the government speak live, listen to their videos, hear them on the radio, read their columns. What are a few things, tangible things that we can do to address some of the problems that you raised? The problems of some of our liberal Jewish cousins, the problems of American policies that are running amok, which you really detailed tonight. What are 2 or 3 things that we can do tangibly right away as remedies for these problems?
You, as a
Yes, as individuals, yes.
Look, the most important thing is get involved. Lobby. Go to an APAC policy conference. Join whatever Jewish organization most closely suits your worldview, so long as I agree with it. But that's very important. 70% of the Jewish electorate voted Democratic, and quite frankly, I think the Democratic Party thinks you're a bought constituency. That's not to say don't vote Democratic, right? But it is to say have some influence on the direction of your party, especially when it comes to foreign policy. And this is one thing that really infuriates me. Don't let these representatives get away with saying, well, I voted for Iron Dome. Everyone votes for Iron Dome. Don't say, oh, it's good, you give me the easy votes. By the way, I hate Iron Dome, okay? Iron Dome is the weapon you use when you're being attacked, okay? Tell your congressman or your senator that Israel should get huge bunker-busting munitions because of their needs. Also, let's get away from this ridiculous talk about the settlements. Look, by the way, I'm not a huge fan of settlements. I just would point out, and I, as editor of the Jerusalem Post, supported disengagement from Gaza. It turns out I was wrong, okay? And I was wrong not because I think disengagement created problems and solved problems, but the central point that we should learn from disengagement with Gaza is that when you remove settlements and when you get the settlers out, you don't get peace, you get war. You don't get a modified adversary, you get an emboldened adversary. So can we please stop talking about how if only we could end settlements and these provocative settlements. This is not a territory. I mean, look, I would love for someone to show me that the conflict between Israel and the Palestinians is a territorial conflict. If so, remove the settlements. Okay, so then you have to cross a border in order to go see Hebron or whatever, and the way that you have to cross a border to go see Banff, right, or Cancun. But so what? But the fact is, this is not a territorial conflict that began in 1967. This is an existential conflict that began 67 years ago. And that's a point that I wish more congressmen would be mindful of. All right, this is not a story about settlements. And there's a pedagogy that's important here. Also, by the way, and this is important because many of you have children and grandchildren in college. You should be enraged and express your rage with college professors and college administrators who allow Israel and Jews to be treated in the way that they would never allow women, gays, African Americans, or any other minority. But you've got me going. I think the Jewish community can learn a lot from the African American community, and in this sense especially. In the 1960s, you got the great laws ending Jim Crow, ending discrimination. But after that, the African American community took it a step further. They made racism a real cultural and social taboo in this country, and they did so by saying, we're not going to accept comedians standing up and making racist jokes. I mean, you can stand at a street corner and say whatever you want to say, but you're not going to get a contract on HBO or whatever. And so they made a point that said, we're going to insist all of America ostracized races. Okay? We're not going to stand for it at all, right? Whereas the Jewish community spends the time saying, well, there are Jews who are anti-Israel, so anti-Zionism can't be considered anti-Semitic, and we've so parsed this issue out that it turns out there's only one anti-Semite in the world, and it's Mel Gibson. Because Mel Gibson's the only guy that says, I hate Jews. So one is saying, well, I don't like Israelis, or I think that Israel's an illegitimate state. We decide you're kosher. So Jews have to stand up time and again and say, I don't accept it. And you may not think that's anti-Semitic, but it is. And if you're going to single out Israel as an illegitimate state, but not single out whether it's Zimbabwe or China or any other country oppressing people, then I'm going to call you an anti-Semite because you're invidiously singling out the Jewish state. And I'm going to say it. And if you want to call me McCarthyite, be my guest. But that's what I believe. Jews are so afraid to be unfashionable. And I love being unfashionable.
Thanks, Brett. We look at the news. It's a humanitarian disaster, Libya, Yemen, and thousands dead. The U.S. We'll talk about U.S. policy. We're on all sides of this. We created ISIS. We created the Taliban. We created Al Qaeda. We backed one tyrant, one insane group after another. Saddam was our guy. We give him weapons of mass destruction. He uses them in Kurds. Then he goes after the Hezbollah and the Iranians. It's this whole nightmare going on. Do you accept any responsibility for it as a neoconservative? I mean, this thing goes, in my view, Obama's as guilty as Hillary Clinton, as Bush, as Cheney. You guys have unleashed the hellhounds in the Middle East. It's a disaster. We're an empire. We're an empire. We have 1,000 bases around the world. We overthrow their governments. We want to know if they hate us. They hate us. They hate us because we're there. We're backing their tyrants. We're there. It's a disaster. Do you, I mean, is it possible maybe your worldview is 180 degrees off?
Yes, it is.
They're not.
And it's
They're not
possible.
attacking, you know, they hate us for a long stuff. They're not attacking Sweden, they're not attacking South America. They're attacking us because we're there. You think that's possible?
Well, first of all, okay, so I take your, look, you asked me, you stood up, and this is a Q&A, so I'm in the spirit of liberal exchange of that. You made a statement, I'm going to treat it as a question, and I'm going to answer it as respectfully as I can. Just today in the news, we found out from Manuel Valls that there have been 5 thwarted jihadi attacks, or would-be terrorist attacks. One that was only thwarted because the jihadi happened to shoot himself in the foot. Okay? There have been terrorist attacks throughout the European continent in countries that were involved on the side of the United States and in countries that were not involved on the side of the United States. So the suggestion that somehow this is a result of our policies, I find kind of interesting and unusual. Last I checked, France was not cheerleading the invasion of Iraq. I seem to remember Jacques Chirac, in fact, being a leading antagonist of the George W. Bush administration. So that's part one. Part two, you mentioned we have 1,000 bases. I defy you to count those bases. I defy you to count. Rand Paul, I don't know if you're a libertarian or on the left, Rand Paul likes to say we have troops in 130 countries. Actually, he's wrong. We have troops in 190 countries. You know how he arrives at that figure? Every embassy that belongs to the United States has a small Marine detachment. By that count, we have troops in Uruguay. We have troops in, Costa Rica. We have troops in Liechtenstein. I don't know if we have an embassy in Liechtenstein, but we would. So when you're offering this attack, I would just urge you not to throw out things that you must have read on the internet because they are farcical statements. Okay, they're simply wrong. Third, we created ISIS. We created the Taliban. I understand.
Not intentionally. It's called blowback.
Well, you see, there you go again. Because one of the things we do when you say we created ISIS is you are denying the people in Islamic State moral agency. And look, I gather you're on the left, right? Cool, awesome. Whatever you are, I love it. It's a free country. We're all, But let's just make sure that when we think of our enemies, we think of them as people with intellects and people with moral agency, people who are not simply lemmings that have been sent in one direction because of the policies of the Eisenhower, Nixon, Reagan, or Bush administrations. ISIS created itself. ISIS emerges from a civilization or a portion of the civilization that is radically anti-American. And the suggestion that somehow we created it is frankly on an intellectual par with the suggestion that 9/11 was an inside job. These people created it. Let me make a better argument for you, okay? Let me make a better argument for you so that when you go at this again, you do so better, okay? Right? There is a credible argument to be made that when the United States went into the Arab world, and when the neoconservatives went into the Arab world, they did so harboring romantic, even Rousseauian illusions about the possibility of bringing liberal democratic culture to civilizations which had never sustained liberal democratic cultures. The real problem with neoconservatives, okay, the real problem with them wasn't that they were cynics, it was that they were idealists. That was the essential problem with the neoconservative vision, that we were going to somehow sweep into Iraq and have an election, and the election was going to bring into being, Jerry Nadler and other liberal Democrats into
to Iraq. Rousseau says man is born free and yet everywhere he is in chains. And so the political solution, therefore, is break those chains. That was the vision of the freedom agenda of George W. Bush. That turned out to be extraordinarily naive. What we learned is that when you have democratic elections in a place like Palestine and a place like Iraq, you don't get liberal Democrats, you get Muslim fanatics, you get the Muslim Brotherhood, you get Hamas, you get other sectarian parties. And so this is a real issue concerning the nature of Arab civilization and how much you can do for it if it doesn't have a liberal DNA. That is to say, respect for women, respect for minorities, and so on. Okay? But it is not right to say that a bunch of cynical neoconservatives said, ha ha ha, let's go in and engineer a disastrous war, which is then going to completely collapse the chances of us pursuing our policies in the next decade because it's going to be such a colossal disaster. Nor does it make sense to say we went in there for oil, because the last thing we did is go in there for oil. I wish we had gone in for oil or some more mundane purposes, right? But we didn't do that. It wasn't the dearth of idealism, it was the surfeit of idealism that became the hobgoblin of the neoconservative movement. If George W. Bush has any analog historically, it's Woodrow Wilson who went to war to make the world safe for democracy, right? Then that means that if Barack Obama has any analog historically, it's Warren Harding.
I may be a little naive. 5 to 7 years ago, here in South Jersey, there was a panel.
I can't hear you.
There was a panel here in South Jersey, including some Israelis and government Israeli-type people, and it said or implied that Israel was going to destroy Iran's nuclear stuff like 5 or 7 years ago, and I don't understand why that didn't happen yet. That's my question.
It's an excellent question. Thank you for asking it. So there are a number of contending theories about why they didn't do it. Number one is they thought the Americans were going to do it, and better have the Americans do it with vastly greater military capability than Israel could bring to bear. Then number two, they came under immense diplomatic pressure, first from the George W. Bush administration, and then especially from the Obama administration, to do nothing. And they were eager to placate the United States. Then number three, and this may be the most worrying explanation, is that Israel has concluded internally that they don't have the wherewithal to conduct a successful strike. Now, if that's the case, they've been conducting a very foolish policy. Very, very foolish. Because if their threats are exposed as a bluff, it will have a material effect on the quality of Israeli deterrence across the board. And that would be another disaster. Now, I would like to think that in the most anticipated military strike in history, the Israelis have figured out or have been doing things that have been that we have not observed. And there are a number of things that they might have done, but I'm not going to tell you about. But this is a real question. And when I have spoken to American military experts, they always say the Israelis don't have the wherewithal to conduct a successful attack. Now, remember, when the Americans say this, they're saying this from the perspective of Americans, which is to say our idea of a successful strike is 100%. Israel's idea of a successful strike may be 65%. Israel may be prepared to accept greater risks and greater losses for the sake of an attack than the United States would. So the views of American military leaders on the subject are dispositive. But this is a real issue that, I mean, I'm leveling you with absolute honesty. There was a report just the other day that Benjamin Netanyahu pushed very hard for a military strike, and he was effectively overruled by his own chief of staff, Benny Gantz. I don't want to judge the Israelis because at the end of the day, they're the ones who face the consequences. And I think we always need, when we comment on Israeli policy, to do so with a due regard for their position, their vulnerability, and their proximity to the problem. And I think that's essential in all our conversations about Israel. That being said, what I think we can provide is a certain amount of perspective on their position that they might not be able to see when they're seeing something that close. Sir?
I'm just going to take the prerogative of a moment and say these will be the last two questions, and then afterwards we have a wonderful Israeli Independence Day party. We spent all afternoon preparing for all of you in our auditorium. So we're going to take these last two questions. You guys have been standing patiently, and then again, everybody is cordially invited into our auditorium for Yom Ha'atzmaut Celebration.
So I forgot to introduce this, or you.
Thank you for your words tonight. You talked about how Hamas has really not demonstrated that it's able to run a state, and I totally agree. My question is, do you think at some point, either now or in the future, it'll be possible to negotiate separately with Hamas and Palestinian Authority? I mean, in a successful way.
Well, are you suggesting twin track negotiations?
Not necessarily multiple states or anything. I'm saying to deal with them separately, you have really different paths and diplomatic styles.
Well, the Israelis do deal with them separately. I mean, there is an implicit negotiation with Hamas in terms of arranging ceasefires, and prisoner exchanges when they happen, and the traffic that comes. Let's not forget that Israel, the evil state, is the state that provides its enemy with all of its electricity and was previously providing with much of its concrete then used to build tunnels in order to terrorize Israelis. I think the lesson of both sets of negotiations is that they failed. You cannot negotiate with people whose aim is to kill you. Right. Better leadership in the Palestinian Authority, but we don't. Look, Mahmoud Abbas is always treated as this terrific monarch. Right? To the gentleman who was asking me questions earlier, how would he feel if George W. Bush had just overstayed his welcome in the White House and were still president today? Probably not good. You should think about Mahmoud Abbas the same way. And by the way, Palestinians deserve better. Palestinians deserve better. They do not deserve the alternatives of a secular kleptocrat in Ramallah versus religious fanatics in Gaza. And we should insist not only that Palestinians need to live up to, they need to deserve the state, but we should start saying, we have expectations of the Palestinians and of their leaders. Why should we be talking with Mahmoud Abbas? I don't understand. Why not simply say, this guy used to be president, his term of office expired in 2009, that was 6 years ago, give us a new president. I mean, if the United States only treated Bibi with as much courtesy as they treat Abbas, Bibi, because he has a democratic mandate, is persona non grata, but Abbas can do whatever he likes. But there's this weird thing, this goes to the psychology of the Jewish people, where we are constantly sort of, in college I took one class, obviously the hard physics class on a pass-fail basis. I passed. But pass-fail usually is like at the C, the D level. If you get a D or above, you pass. But with Israeli behavior, the pass-fail grade is always like A. Like, either you get an A or you're a failure. And that's the way the world treats Israel, and sometimes that's the way we Jews treat ourselves. Unless our behavior is perfect, exemplary, there's never a problem, we're a complete failure. So Bibi made an ugly remark at the heat of an election campaign, right? Absolutely. By the way, Biden made lots of ugly remarks. And so suddenly we're a nation of moral reprobates, right? But, Abbas insists that Israel is committing genocide when it's defending itself last summer, and no one holds them to account. When everything is expected of you, nothing is forgiven. And when nothing is expected of you, everything is forgiven. And we have to turn that equation around.
Thank you very much for allowing us to spend the evening with you. It's a question that's been bothering me for a long time. Maybe One of the reasons that we're pulling back from the Middle East and from the rest of the world, I understand, is that we're war weary. So first I'd like to ask, how many people here have members, close members of their family that have served in Iraq or active duty military?
Raise your hand.
So then the question is, why are we war weary?
That's right.
And I say, why are we war weary? Why are we pulling out of the Middle East? Because we're tired of the war. And I ask this because I want to know who is tired. Now, my son is tired, and his compatriots and his members of his units are tired. The military is being broken, and the military is really war weary. But they'll go back, they'll fight. If you said, go back now to Iraq, retake Fallujah, and push these guys out, they'll go, they'll have volunteers. My son's men will volunteer and they'll go back. But why are the rest of us weary?
It's a wonderful question. First of all, really all honor to your son. One of my best friends is a former Navy SEAL who lost some of his men in Ramadi. One of them, a Medal of Honor winner, or posthumous Medal of Honor winner. I think he now has a ship named after him, Mike Mansour. And as I talked to my friend, what makes him sick isn't that the military's been hard pressed, that he sacrificed so much when he was deployed in Iraq. It's that the places he fought for and where his men were lost are being abandoned, and nobody seems to care. We raised our flag on Iwo Jima in 1945, and we cared that that flag had not been raised and then simply abandoned. That we accomplished and it's, I think what, at least in my conversations with veterans of the Iraq and Afghanistan war, it isn't that they paid a sacrifice, it's that the sacrifice is being let go of so cheaply for the sake of precisely what you said. The comment, well, we're war weary. Just that. People should bear in mind that we were war weary after World War I, where we lost more than 100,000 troops. In fact, we lost more men on the last day of World War I than we've lost in Afghanistan. The last day, November 11th, 1918. That was the scale of the sacrifice. Americans after that were war weary. And what they did was they pulled back under the Harding administration, otherwise known as the Obama administration. They pulled back. They had normalcy. Harding pursued a foreign policy of disarmament conferences, Washington Naval Treaty. Harding is a great subject to read about. Republicans like Calvin Coolidge signed something called the Pact of Paris, the Kellogg-Briand Pact, outlawing war forever. America imagined that our oceans were moats and we could pull up the drawbridge and the rest of the world would have to fend for itself. America imagined that perhaps it was all its own fault for getting involved in the war in the first place. Original American sin. Very interesting concept, by the way. That's another speech. And what we got was a world in which Japan figured out that if it invaded Manchuria, there would be no consequence. So Italy invaded Ethiopia, and there was no consequence. So Germany seized the Sudetenland, and there was no consequence. And then we got to the Second World War. People talk about World War II as the good war. World War II is not the good war. 300 American soldiers died every single day in World War II for close to 4 years. World War II was a colossal tragedy for the United States. And we need to conduct a foreign policy that ensures that we never make that mistake again by preferring our illusions to looking at the world and seeing what it is, and seeing that American power is the margin, and I say this directly to our gentleman on the left here, my left. American power is the margin, the buffer between civilization and barbarism, and long may it be so. Thank you.